The We Knew the Moon podcast is now the official podcast of the Goddess Temple Twickenham. Find out more on their website, www.goddesstempletwickenham.org, or find the Goddess Temple Twickenham on Facebook and Instagram. You're listening to We Knew the Moon with Dee Safier, an empath who started a podcast to explore the universe, spirituality, and all things witchy woo-woo. Don't forget to check out the website weknewthemoon.co.uk for all your I do what I want and the moon made me do it merch, whichever excuse you prefer to use for all of your life choices. Hi everyone, this is Dee and this is the We Knew the Moon podcast, and today we're joined by Michelle Alderson again. Hi Michelle.
Hello Dee.
You're like my semi-regular, like quarterly guest now, which I absolutely love because we always have so much fun together.
I love it. I love doing these with you, Dee. Thank you for asking me back.
Whenever people ask me what's involved in, like, when I ask them if they want to be a guest, I tell them it's like uni, but without all the shit bits, in that you get to pick exactly what topic you are interested in, and you can read as much or as little as you want about it, but then you don't have to go and write like some long essay about it to be judged or graded or whatever. You just get to talk to a friend about it.
Which is lovely. It's great, isn't it?
Yeah. So yeah, really, really happy to have you back. So we had fun on the last episode, and this time round, it is your turn to present a topic to me, and I'm really excited about this one. I say that every time, but it's true every time. Tell me, what are you going to tell us about?
So today I'm going to be talking about fairies and fairy folk.
Oh, so excited.
Would you like to hear all about it?
I would like to hear everything you know about fairies and fairy folk.
All right. In my previous podcast, I talked about cunning women and their possible connection to witchcraft and the witch trials, didn't I? And today I'm going to be telling you about another related concept that also played a role in the reframing of paganism itself, cunning folk. So those of you who listened into it would have heard me mention something about elf infestations. Do you remember, Dee?
Oh, right. Yes, I remember, because we thought, how cute does that sound?
You thought that was really funny, didn't you? Do you remember?
I would love a little elf infestation.
So today I'm going to expand on that a little bit more, and I'm going to bring it back into the topic that I just said I'm going to talk about. So today I'm going to take that little concept there about elf infestations, and I'm going to expand it into fairies, fairy folk.
Oh, fun.
So I'm going to start by talking about what a fairy is and some of the different ways they've been viewed and represented in history. I'm going to tell you a little bit about fairy folklore around the world, and then I'm going to tell you about how fairies got caught up with witchcraft. And then I'm going to tell you about a local, to me, story, an extremely famous real-world tale of fairies from the early 20th century. I'm going to be telling you about the Cottingley Fairies of Bradford.
Oh my God, this is so fun. And I love when you bring in some of your local folklore and stories and so forth.
I couldn't talk about fairies, could I, without mentioning the most famous fairy story possibly there ever has been. Mm-hmm. And it's just on my doorstep. So I have to go there, don't I?
For sure. And everything you just listed there is literally everything I want to know about fairies. So I'm settling in for the ride.
Fantastic. So I'm going to start with, what is a fairy then, Dee? What do you reckon?
So you know you've got like your Disney fairies, don't you?
Yeah.
Which like Tinkerbelly type fairies. And then you've got like the creepy, mischievous fairies.
Yeah. Definite ideas come to mind though, don't they?
Yeah, for sure.
So what do they look like, do you reckon?
I think of like little people.
Yeah, little tiny people.
Probably living in some kind of forest or wood.
Yeah.
Enchanted forest, probably.
Enchanted. They're little and cute.
Well,
yeah.
Yes, because I find the creepy looking fairies cute.
I did come across some of those along my travels researching this, yes.
Well, who's the artist that does those?
The creepy fairies.
Yeah, gotta have a think.
Oh, I don't know, I'm afraid, off the top of my head.
I'm gonna text Michelle because she's got them tattooed.
Has she? Oh my goodness.
She's got a fairy tattoo that's like creepy.
A creepy fairy.
Yeah.
But I reckon though, Dee, if you ask people on the street about what a fairy is, I don't think they'd automatically go to the creepy version, would they?
Yeah. No, they don't. I think they will think Disney fairy.
I think they'd think the little cute ones, the beautiful ones with the little tiny, gorgeous, delicate wings, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
With the cute little, what do they wear? What do you reckon, Dee?
Little tutus. I'm literally thinking Tinkerbell.
Tinkerbell, pixie boots, floaty little dresses, possibly a hat made of leaf.
Lots of like stardust, angel dust floating around, little wand maybe. Is that a fairy?
Yeah, magic dust. And what can they do then, Dee? So when we think about fairies, we think about what they do, don't we? And we think about magic, we think about fairy dust.
They can float around and fly.
Float or fly or hover or...
I imagine that they can whiz around real fast.
Yeah, and things like that. So
yeah,
we've got all those basic images. I think if you asked anybody, they'd probably come up with those same descriptions, wouldn't they? And today, fairies very much associated with children, aren't they? With childlike concepts and fairy tales and cute magical stories. And like you said, you think of them as like cute but mischievous. You don't mean nasty or...
No, like even Tinkerbell was a little bit stroppy, wasn't she, when she didn't get her way?
I love Tinkerbell. I love the way she bangs her feet on the floor and her little shoes make that little...
Very relatable, right? We've all been there.
Yeah, so they may be a little stroppy, they may be, a little mischievous, but basically they're placid and harmless and sweet, aren't they? And we see these fairies everywhere. So they're in literature, on telly, in books, in films. They're just a basic staple, aren't they, of today's culture. And I, as an artist, I've drawn this kind of fairy many, many times in my illustration work. But the concept of fairies and fairy folk actually has an extremely long history. And this little version that we're talking about, is actually really very recent.
It's literally the Disney fairy, I think.
I think it is. I think it's literally the Disney fairy. I think it's a bit like the Cola Santa.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we've got fairy history dating right back to ancient human times. And almost every human culture around the world that exists now or has existed previously has had stories about fairies and fairy folklore.
Oh, I love that when something comes up throughout time, different cultures.
Different times, different cultures, but as far back as you can have, that we can look in ancient human history, there have been fairies or fairy folk. Now, they don't look like the Disney fairies that we're talking about. They may not have the same sort of personalities and characteristics, but fairy folk and ones that you would actually recognise. But what I didn't know and what I didn't realise when I started off researching this, Dee, is that lots of different kinds of magical beings, elves and gnomes and etc., they're actually fairies.
Ooh, I was going to ask.
Yeah, they come under the heading of fairy folk. So they might have different names and they might have different things that they are, like, elves and gnomes and all sorts. But I'll tell you what, I've got a list here, right? And some of these you'll recognise, and they're all fairies. They all come under the fairy folk.
Can you do me a favour and send me that list?
I will. And this is just a few.
Oh, my God.
Honestly, I could go on and on and on, but I've got a few here that I thought you might recognise. So the she and leprechauns of Irish folklore. So the will-o'-the-wisps, that's English folklore. Elves and trolls of Norse mythology. The brownies of Scottish and European mythology. Pixies of southwest England, Devon and Cornwall. So they're little pixies. Dwarves, again, Norse and Germanic. Gnomes, hobgoblins and goblins. Sprites, pygmies, corrigans, imps. All of these are fairies. And some like the Hulderfolk or the hidden people of Iceland. Fox fairies, China, Japan, the Alok sprites of the Maya peoples, Slavic fairies. Honestly, the list could go on and on.
So what you're saying is that literally every country, every culture, every folklore background has got some kind of fairy. And do you know what I thought of when you were reading that list that I think is a bit weird? So did you ever go to Brownies?
I did. I was an imp.
Me too.
You weren't?
Yeah, but how weird, because Brownies in this country, I moved around a lot and I went to Brownies in Holland before I came here. And no offense, but Brownies in Holland was so much more fun. We used to just play and whatever. Whereas here it was much more religious. I don't know if it was just my
It was very religious. I'm doing the dibs now while I'm on the thing for you.
We had to, exactly, the God, Queen, country, whatever. And then you had to do, like, we had to do lots of prayers at the end of the session. And it was, lots of the activities were actually services in church and so on. So
they were based in churches, weren't they, mostly?
Yeah, we met in a church hall. So I quit the Brownies because it was fucking boring to me and I didn't know the words to the songs and, But how weird that it's called the Brownies and you could either be I remember an imp, a leprechaun, a pixie, or a something else, right?
There were all different colours.
Yeah. But how strange that it's so religious and yet they take so much from the sort of spiritual world.
Right. I might come on to that topic a little bit further on as well.
Oh, right. I'll wait then.
Yeah, it did. It is a strange thing that it did exist within the church setting. At that point, I think the fairy folk had got down to sort of more cute level. However, do you remember the badge for the imp?
Yeah.
It kind of had like little pointy feet and little pointy hands, didn't it?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I remember. I was really happy because it was the kind of creepiest badge out of them.
Yes. Germanic folklore are the imps.
Anyways, yeah, it was a little bit creepy. It wasn't fully cute. It was cute creepy.
It was cute creepy, but yeah, I did like Brownies. I wasn't really into the religion bit, but I did like singing, so I joined in with gusto because I just loved sing along.
I like playing the games and everything, but also in Holland, it was much more outsidey.
Right, of course.
It was like always in the church hall here. It was very inside, because it's like city setting and stuff. So it was just, yeah.
It's lovely anyway. It's an interesting point that it was part of the church and it did have symbolisms. Like, do you remember when you joined the circle of the Brownies, it was seats and the seats were toadstools.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of pagan imagery right there. Like you were saying, it didn't occur to me actually to remember these things.
It's bizarre, isn't it, when you think about it? It's coming all back. But like, I don't think they had the same kind of like pagan roots or pagan ideas in Scouts or anything like that, did they?
I don't know. They were more into sort of the animal imagery, weren't they? The foxes and the larger creatures, I think.
And what were you before you were a Scout? You were like a badger or something, weren't you?
Was it beavers?
Beavers, that's it, yeah. Just unusual, isn't it, to have...
It is, and that actually, going back there, that was a strange memory, actually. I didn't...
Yeah. Oh, well, it's nice to be speaking to a sister imp.
A sister imp? I didn't realise we had that in common as well, Dee. Back to fairies then. So we said there was loads of different kinds of different fairies all over the world, different names for them. But one of the very, very earliest examples is something called the Peri, or sometimes known as the fairy folk from ancient Persia. So what is today's Iran? Now, these were exquisitely beautiful beings, but they didn't have the little insect wings. They had what we would consider like angel wings, feathered, large angel wings. They, again, were usually portrayed as female, like a lot of fairies are. And they were basically human in appearance and height, so they weren't tiny. I mean, without the wings, they could have passed as human, is basically what I'm saying.
Besides the fuck off big wings.
Beside the big wings, they were basically looked like...
Barely noticed them.
a female, okay, the human. So they were thought to be the souls of the dead, who were not permitted entry to the afterlife paradise, not because they were evil, but because they weren't quite good enough to be angelic. So they existed in this in-between purgatory state.
Right, okay, cool. We got to do an episode on purgatory as well. Heaven, hell, and purgatory is an episode I want to do because that's another concept that keeps on coming up.
It comes up a lot with this fairy folk because...
Where you go where you're good, where you go where you're bad, and what happens when you haven't quite reached any.
No, and this is what's really strange about a lot of these fairy folklores, Dee, is that this concept keeps coming up again and again and again, that fairies exist in this dimension that is between heaven and earth. It is in a state of like an in-between purgatory state. So this is a familiar concept. So this is why we hear about their worlds being sometimes visible to humans, but not always, that there's this other dimension that is the world of fairies that exists between places.
And is that why they're slightly like known as mischievous? Because they're not bad, but they're not angelic enough yet?
Exactly. And certainly these ones, the Perry folk, they were thought to be not quite good enough to have got into heaven. So they existed neither on the earth and neither in heaven. They existed in this in-between state. Yes, so they would have been a little bit naughty, but not quite naughty enough to go to hell.
Like cheeky.
A bit cheeky and not good enough, not quite good enough to go to heaven. So there's this in-between fairy world, and this is what we're talking about. And this is a theme, like I said, that recurs in lots of these.
And can you get out of that? Do they eventually get to heaven?
No.
Oh.
I think the point of the fairy world is that's it. You're
just there.
You're just there.
Purgatory in the Christian sense, you're condemned to roll a boulder up a hill until you've absolved all your sins, and then you can go into heaven.
So there's always a chance to move on to heaven in Christianity. Maybe I've not read enough yet, Dee, and maybe I've not known enough about the fairy world yet.
We should have a little look into whether you can be promoted to heaven eventually, or whether that's it. That's just your home. I mean, to be honest, this fairy purgatory sounds kind of fun.
Yeah.
No one's bad. No one's evil, or they would have gone to hell.
No.
But they know how to have fun.
They know how to have fun. And key to this is that a lot of times humans get glimpses of this world because it's not as far away as heaven to us. We get glimpses of this world occasionally, apparently, in a lot of the fairy folklore. But I want to tell you about the earliest written down about fairies. The first literature was actually in Homer's Iliad. That was the first written word about fairy folk, and that was from 850 before Common Era.
And who were the fairies? I'm trying to remember.
Were dryads and nymphs.
The nymphs, yeah.
The nymphs and dryads. And it describes in the book about how they were dancing. But actually, although this was the first written down, nymph-like beings were commonly found in both Egyptian and Greek history.
So a nymph is a fairy too?
A nymph is a fairy too. A dryad is a fairy too. So all of these come under this umbrella of fairy folk.
And can I just make a really good book recommendation? A book that I read that was so good, because you're a reader too, aren't you?
I am avid, yes.
Yeah. Circe,
I think I've seen that one.
So she's one of the main nymphs that, the Odyssey and the Iliad are written about. Odysseus, that's it. So this book, Madeline Miller, she's written it from the perspective of Circe, the nymph that Odysseus stayed with for a long time.
Right.
And then he basically fucked off and left her.
Right.
Yeah, because, the Odyssey was him trying to get home to his wife, who he loves, blah, blah, blah.
Ah, but he fell in love with a nymph, did he?
Yeah, got a bit sidetracked a few times. That's why it took him something like 20 years to get home from Turkey to Greece. So not that far, even in those days.
Not that far. But again, time is a strange concept because in the fairy world, they say the time goes much faster. So this 20 years could have been 2 minutes he was with the nymph, possibly, if we believe him. But I'll have to read the book.
Yeah, sounds like excuses to me.
It does sound like excuses.
I was a nymph. I'm sorry. It's not my fault. She's a nymph. Anyways, it was so well written. And she's got another book about Achilles, I think. But yeah, it was really well written and just so fun to have it written from like the other side, Yeah.
Oh, I will have to look that one up, Dee, and I will certainly have a read. I don't really know much about nymphs. The things that I did look up were, again, they said they were like full-size human. They weren't your tiny little what you imagine as fairies. They were full-size, usually female, very beautiful, enchanting, but they were unwinged, no wings at all on a nymph. So actually, I'm not sure how you would know a human from a nymph, really.
Yeah.
They're usually drawn just like a human female in paintings and things, but they're described as ethereal, elusive, delicate, and enchanting. But again, they're thought to be existing in this in-between state. So they're not actually of the earth and they're not actually of heaven either. So possibly overlapping the human world, but maybe definitely if Odysseus has managed to...
Well, yeah, because, Greek mythology and Roman mythology, people just interacted with the gods and the nymphs and the whatnots, didn't they? Like, they had kids with them sometimes, and because you had demigods and, you just bump into, like, Zeus here and there.
So I wonder how you'd know you were with a fairy rather than a human. I'm not sure unless they have special powers. So like I said, I've not read that book, but I do know that nymphs are supposed to represent some elements of the natural world. So rivers and waters and trees and mountains and things like that. So, I mean, that's really interesting. But what I find most interesting about that is just the representation of them as basically human. And so in lots of early representations of fairy folk, they weren't generally smaller than humans. They were usually unwinged as well.
Yeah. And then also, so far we've talked mainly about ones that are probably thought of to be attractive and so forth. But if you're telling me that like trolls and stuff are also Celt fairies, they're not known for their good looks. So it's not even that they're cute or pretty or whatever. So...
No, but one thing that is common to these stories, as well as this fairy world that exists between the earth and the heavens, is their character. Now, like we just touched on before, they're not evil. They're not being so bad that they've gone to hell, and they're not good enough to go to heaven, apparently. But they're said to be, and lots of them described as unpredictable, havoc creating, morally ambivalent, tricksy, and sometimes actually feared. In some cultures, in some stories of fairies around the world, to say the word fairy is actually considered bad luck because of this, because they're thought to be a little bit scary. So instead, words like little people or the good people or fair folk are used instead. So a lot of the time, they're not associated with nice things.
I mean, that description just sounded super fun to me. But I guess if you're in a conservative, Puritan, religious society, then yeah, you would probably be nervous of these havoc wreakers.
I think so. But like you said, it's a little like the cheeky mischievousness that has trickled down to like the Tinkerbell characters, hasn't it? But in some cultures, throughout history, fairy folk were just on the border of actually being quite terrifying. And so people would have been, wary of them. They'd approached them with some trepidation. And also, fairies were thought to, if they did have interactions with humans, that it might be in exchange for something, that they wouldn't necessarily interact with you for your benefit. It might be for theirs. So you might be in a deal.
Well, in this capitalist society, you can't judge them for that, huh? No such thing as a free lunch.
You can't judge them for that. Because their honesty was never guaranteed, you see. Dealing with fairies was often thought to be risky and unpredictable. So you didn't know whether you might have a positive interaction with a fairy folk, a negative one. This was the reason why there was quite a lot of fear around the potentially meeting or experiencing fairies and their world, you see. So these are things to consider. And actually, when we come on in a moment to talk about their connection to witchcraft, this is a really key point to remember.
So what I'm getting from this is that good to have a party with a fairy.
Yeah.
But probably not the best business partner.
Exactly. So, exactly that indeed. So most of the time, you may be wary about your interaction because you couldn't be guaranteed whether they'd be nice or not.
Yeah.
And so this is a common theme that's going through it. And like I said, I think it might have something to do with their state of fairy world being hanging there in the middle of good and bad, if you know what I mean. So there is a theory, though, that fairies and fairy folk mythology actually sprang from pagan belief, because just as we said, fairies and elves and goblins and things, they're often associated with the natural world. So it's landscapes, natural features, it's inexplainable beauty sometimes, and it's integrated world. So as we've said in previous podcasts, early humans would have been really aware of the natural world and how They needed to approach things to survive, basically. And I think maybe a lot of these fairy folks were personifications of these places, the waters, etc. So, and I think that's still the case today, isn't it? So you think of like the traditional fairy folks, they're associated with things like flowers, aren't they, and plants, and gnomes with gardens, and trolls with water. I think it makes complete sense, really, if we try and understand fairy folk and the legends around them based on actual human thinking. It would make sense, wouldn't it? So it would make sense of the slight fear of them, but also the beauty and the enchantment of them. And like nature being, how many times do we think of water can be passive, but it can also be deadly, and so can any.
Mm-hmm. So they're using these fairy folk as like kind of to help them understand these different forces in nature that affect their lives, like their crops and their livelihoods and their...
Yeah, I think that's one explanation, and it's one that I thought was a real possibility.
Yeah, and that would explain the wariness, because Brian Froud, sorry, is the artist.
Oh, no, you've remembered the artist.
I haven't. Michelle texted me back.
Remember something, I just yell it out, so...
Sorry. So yeah, Brian Froud is the one that's done, a lot of the imagery that we not think about when we think of fairies come from kind of Brian Froud.
I will have a look at those specifically when we finished recording today. We were just saying, weren't we, that fairies are, I think, that's just my point of view, but I think they're possibly a layover from early pagan thinking and how they associate the natural world with the philosophy of living, if you like, of humans. And I think it would also make sense that most fairies are portrayed as female, because, again, I'm referring back to the previous podcast when we talked about cunning women, and we said that the female form, the femininity itself, was thought of as the integral part of the cycle. And a lot of fairies are still portrayed as female, representing, I think, that connection to reproduction and the
cycles of nature. Yeah, it makes sense.
I think so, but like I said, that's just my thought on it. But it's obviously, there's lots of elements at play there, but I think that's one of the stronger things. Back to the cunning women just for a moment, and the folk of the early centuries. So there was plenty of mythology around fairy folk by then, and fairy folk were still well within the original ideas of them, so rather feared, with people wary of encountering them, with the idea of them being mischievous and possibly even dangerous sometimes, and, as we said, only helpful if there was something in it for them. So traditions and superstitions had built up around the idea of the potential dangers of encountering fairy folk, and some of the only people perhaps deemed strong enough or expert enough to deal with them were people in the know, like cunning folk.
Ooh, it all comes round.
Professional and spiritual role was specifically to deal with people's problems, wasn't it? So they possibly claimed to be some of the only people who could deal with the fairy folk and manage their mischief.
Right, so that's why they were the ones to help you if you had an elf infestation.
Right, now that would be quite the USP, wouldn't it? Can you imagine? So they're saying possibly, now this is just from me reading stuff and putting A and B together, that possibly they were saying, actually, we're experts. I can deal with the fairies. I'll talk to them for you. I'll get rid of this elf infestation that you seem to have. So I think that's possibly what may have occurred. And remember, we touched on saying that they said that elf infestations were possibly what we would now say were neurological diseases or mental illnesses, epilepsy. So they wouldn't have understood those diseases themselves. Possibly cunning folk wouldn't either. But what they could do is say, you have an elf infestation. I can talk to the elf. I can help you with that. And perhaps that would be one of the things, one of the services that they would definitely offer. What do you reckon?
Yep, it's all coming round full circle.
I think so. I think that makes perfect sense, actually. So no one could prove either way that your cunning folk lady was wrong, could they?
Yeah, and it kind of came up in the episode, a couple episodes back, on exorcisms as well, which I know you haven't listened to, but I will just say, because a lot of the things that people got exorcised for we now recognize were probably mental health issues or physical ailment that people didn't understand at the time. So it was explained away as being possessed by a demon, which is not that different an idea as being infested by elves, is it?
No, it's not. In fact, it's just words, isn't it, really? They're just really, probably trying to pin something down and say this is what it is, and then B, trying to understand how they can fix it when actually the fixes were possibly beyond them at the time. You know, we understand a lot more now about mental illness and neurological diseases, but clearly they didn't then, and they would have been, you know, something that they were trying to fix. And perhaps cunning folk weren't, you know, duplicitous. Perhaps they were genuinely trying to fix something that they didn't understand.
Exactly. Just like we don't understand most about many neurological conditions ourselves now. And so I'm sure that, you know, in 100 years, doctors and so forth will look back at how we treat mental health. I mean, just think of how they treated mental health issues in like the 60s when they were doing lobotomies and electric shock therapy. That's not that long ago. So yeah, I'm sure that people in the future will think, what the hell were we doing? So yeah, it's just, they're, like you said, they're trying to explain something that they don't have the knowledge about yet and do what they can to know.
And actually, perhaps your cunning woman, lady folk, could have tried different methods, and possibly, like we were saying previously in the other podcast, I don't want to keep going backwards, but we talked about the placebo effect, didn't we? And it's powerful, and so perhaps a lot of the time it did help. You don't know, do we?
Yeah.
But they maybe would have tried. It maybe would have been one of their services that was advertised. And then, unfortunately, we're talking about just small hop and a skip then to associate fairies and fairy folk with these cunning. And as Christianity and organised religion grew in popularity, it became rebranded, didn't it, as heathen, ungodly thinking, and fairies became lumped in then with cunning folk, parcel of this supposed ancient world. They thought it was old-fashioned and outdated and something that I'm guessing that they wanted to be rid of. So seen eventually as demons and evil accomplices to witches, rather than the annoyances the cunning folk struggled to deal with their remedies.
Because fairies were also like, we always blame them for hiding things in our house. If you can't find something, it's because the fairies moved them. Like that's the level of like inconvenience that they used to be thought of, right? Like Exactly
that. And I'm guessing that's what you went to your cunning folk lady for, because maybe you went because your cow was sick, or you've missing your keys, or someone's actually taken them, but you don't know that. So you've gone to check, and they may have a loss for what else to tell you. They've said, oh, well, it must have been an elf or a fairy or the mischief of an imp, or what you need to do now is and get rid of the problem this way. So that would possibly be it. So by the time the witch trials were beginning, cunning folk, now reframed as witches, were probably, you know, they were associated with this mischief and these strange magical beings. And I think possibly there was some change in language there as well. So when they talk about familiars and demons, I think those are possibly the fairy folks that we are referring to. And so they thought, you know, the witch finders at the trials, that they must therefore have been able to communicate with these otherworldly creatures and beings. I mean, they were advertising the services as such, surely they
were self-confessed chatting to the fairy. Can I just interrupt for a second to say, have you been watching Witchfinder on BBC One?
I have not. What is it like, Dee?
It's funny.
It's funny. My husband has been watching it and I haven't, because I've thought, I was a bit offended actually, to be honest. I thought, what, this isn't funny? But he said it was.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's about very traumatic stuff.
Yeah.
So if you don't think too deeply into that, but it is funny because it highlights how fucking stupid.
How stupid it was.
Yeah. But it's very much the kind of humor of Ghosts. Did you watch Ghosts?
I did, and I love that.
Yeah. So if you like that.
I love that.
Yeah. No, it was worth it. We binged it yesterday and watched the whole of it in one go.
The whole of Witchfinder. Yeah, I will. I'll get to it, Dee. So you're the second person to recommend. So I don't.
It is good because it did highlight just how stupid it all was. And the girl in it, Thomasina, who is from a show that I've never watched, but Paul really rates, This Country. I never seen it, but she's so good. She's so fucking good. Like right from the start, the opening scene, she's like,
I will watch it. I'll remember what you said.
All right, let me know when you watch it.
Very good. Right, now I'm going to tell you a little bit about another thing that I discovered, right? And it's on the same topic mostly, but the changeling concept. Have you heard of that?
Yes. So there's so many words that are linked to this topic. So I'm really interested to hear how they all fit in together.
Right. So again, we talked about the elf infestations, cunning folks explaining away illnesses, right? Well, the changeling was thought to be when a baby, a human baby, had been swapped mischievously for a fairy baby. So fairies, we said, exist in this in-between dimension, and they can't access the earthly existence anymore, and they can't get to heaven. So they're stuck in this middle dimension, but apparently they do remember and they do want to get back to the earthly plane. So the changeling concept comes when a fairy tries to swap for a human. And again, it's really strange because changelings are said to be sort of sickly children, sickly human children. So if, for example, you took an ill child to your cunning person to say, look, my baby's sick, what do I do? If they couldn't fix them and they didn't think there was any cure, they would say, oh, there's nothing we can do. It's probably a changeling, i.e. fairies have swapped your baby for one of theirs. And what that really means is that the baby is going to die because a fairy, although it keeps trying to come back to the human realm, can't stay here. So they die.
Oh, that's awful.
It is. It's terrible, isn't it? So the changeling is given as an explanation for the deaths of children.
And that must be another main reason why there's this negative perception of fairies, if they are basically baby killers. Well, it's clearly an explanation that was used for like cot death or one of the many things that sadly affect children, babies.
Things that weren't understood. You know, maybe you'd try and make the mum or the parents feel better and say, oh, it must have been a changeling. I'm so sorry. We haven't got an explanation for your child's illness or death. But again, there's loads of stories around this concept of this changeling. So possibly it would be, again, one of those things that you would try and be fixed, and maybe your local cunning person would offer that as a service as well to actually exorcise, the fairy out of your baby to make it well again.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can't imagine being like a new mum, especially at a time where pregnancy and childbirth were even more risky than they are now. And you would do anything, wouldn't you, if you...
You would. So I found this really peculiar. I thought, is that supposed to be comforting, the explanation of that? Or would it just be absolutely terrifying, thinking, fairies might take my baby?
I know. That would just be, again, I'm not a mum, you are, but that would just be another thing to the long list of things I'd be paranoid about happening that you have little control over.
And so I'm guessing, again, this is why I'm trying to think it might be a nature explanation, because humans, we just need to process things, don't we? We need to say, this is why I can deal with this if I actually have the reason.
Yeah. I like what you said about how I think possibly it would be nice to know, nice being the wrong word, but you couldn't have done anything. It wasn't anything you as a parent did.
Absolutely. And perhaps that would be the comfort that the cunning person will perhaps be able to give the mum and say, look, it wasn't your...
So, you're obviously still going to be dealing with your grief and your sadness and your heartbreak, but you don't also have to beat yourself up about potentially, did I do something wrong or whatever. So I guess that's comforting.
It's a strange semi-comfort, isn't it? But at the same time, a terrifying thinking, what if a fairy did take your baby? And the first sniffles and whatever, you'd think, oh my God, has the fairy been and taken my...
But that for sure has got to be why they had a bad rep then, because more than just hiding your keys, they could kill your babies, and that would not very nice, even if it's unintentional.
No, strange. An interplay of all these concepts, haven't we, of like the fairy world and the fairies trying to access back into the human worlds and being sort of semi-visible to us at some points, but not really. And perhaps we're not supposed to see the fairy world unless we actually arrive there ourselves. I'm not sure, but there's all these sort of concepts come together, and then we said about the natural explanations, and then all human cultures having similar explanations for nature and things, just so much that fits together. So it was a bit like going down a rabbit hole, really. Then I moved on to sort of why then did we move onto this sort of different kind of a fairy? Where did these mischievous, possibly evil kind of, well, not evil, but your baby snatching fairies, how did they become Tinkerbell?
Yeah.
And maybe not all of them did, but I think that, as we've said many times before, as religion got more organised and things got sort of overwritten, didn't they? A lot of the pagan thinking and thoughts and imagery and things got basically overwritten.
Yeah, like incorporated and changed and assimilated and twisted. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. So I wonder whether the fairy folk, if you remember, of Persia, the ones with the beautiful angel wings, became the angels of the Bible. I don't know. I wonder if the more mischievous sort of fairies became characters like Lilith, who, in the story of Lilith, if you remember, she was disobedient to Adam, wasn't she? She didn't do as she was told. She was rather mischievous. And her escape was she grew wings and flew away. And she had to exist forever in an in-between state, never being allowed to get to heaven.
Well, that's like word for word the same story.
Isn't it? And also, what is familiar about Lilith and babies, children? What's the connection there? Do you know the connection?
Does she snatch babies?
She takes babies. She takes babies because God cursed her and said she was not to become a mother. So he cursed her in being barren, never being able to bear children. So she takes children. Every time she tries to feed them, they die. The baby dies because to breast and filled them with poison instead of milk.
What a lovely God.
So, yeah, first of all, what a horrific story. But I'm wondering where all these elements of this story came from. And suddenly lots of things seem to make sense with the changeling concept, with the in-between of the fairy world. And so I think sometimes we can still see these fairies in these stories in organised religion, in Christianity as well. So I don't think they were eradicated as such. But I think the main thing, and this is where I'm moving on to the Cottingley Fairies, I think when we talk about how fairies changed to being the really sweet fairies, I think the Victorian time is where we need to look next, because Victorian times are thought to be the age of the child, the new understanding of childhood. So lots of scientific discoveries, lots of finding out of different species, different plants, lots of naming of them, lots of categorising of them, and particularly lots of categorising of very small insects with lovely, beautiful wings. So in the Victorian times, one of the quite big hobbies, wasn't it, for collecting insects from around the world. You'd said, I've been here, I've been there, I've found all the beetles, I've found all these flying insects. And they actually put them in little boxes, didn't they, with these gorgeous, translucent, iridescent winged, tiny little creatures. I think there we can maybe see the beginning of the little fairies as we know them now coming into play. So we've got children's laws being made for children's right, their education. And
yeah, because pre this, they were working in factories at age 4 and getting their hands chopped off by accident in machines and stuff like that, right? So, yeah.
Absolutely. We've got a queen on the throne, Victoria, who is Mum of the Year. She's basically uber mum, isn't she? So she's photographed with her children a lot, doing lots of activities with her children. And this inspires this new thinking about children being the centre of the world, sort of to be the thing that they focus on. So we're in the Victorian age. Just moving on slightly now, I'm going to move a little bit closer to the Cottingley Fairies. So we've got all of those things in place, and I believe that fairies, or the fairy folklore, is moving more towards what we would now understand them to be, these tiny, gorgeous, cute things. And it's 1917. World War I is 2 years in. So this is the time of the Cottingley Fairies. So we've got soldiers away fighting. We've got families separated, displaced in different places in the world where they will be. And here we are. It's 1917. And Frances Griffith, who was 16 at the time, along with her mum, returned to England from where they were living in Cape Colony in South Africa. and they went to live with the mother's sister, her auntie Polly, and her husband Arthur, and their daughter Elsie, who was just 9, in Cottingley in Bradford. Now, it's sort of just right on the outskirts. It's a tiny little village. It's still in Bradford, but it's a tiny little village just on the outskirts. Francis's dad had been called up to fight in the war, so he hadn't travelled with them. So just Francis and her mum had come to England at the time. And Francis had brought a book with her, possibly bought on the trip for the long journey on the ship, and it was called The Princess Mary's Gift Book, and it was a charity publication. You know, you don't realise these things go that far back, but it was a charity publication which had a collection of stories and poems inside, pictures and lots of things from famous authors and illustrators of the day. And it was to collect money for something called the Queen's Work for Women Fund.
Oh, well, sounds lovely.
It does sound lovely, doesn't it? Well, it had lots, like we said, lots of stories inside. And one of them was written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was the author of Sherlock Holmes.
Sherlock Holmes fame, yeah.
And a very famous spiritualist at the time. So inside this book, there was also a poem that was written by Alfred Noyes called A Spell for a Fairy. And it was illustrated by Claude Shepperson. And it had lovely little inked drawings of more like nymphs than, it didn't have the winged fairies, but it had, they were clearly fairies, but they didn't have the wings, dancing, so with the little arms and legs all down. All right. She'd come to England with this book to stay with her family while her dad was off at war. So the story begins one day when Frances came home from playing by the beck, which is like a bit of water. It's a bit like a stream, and it was behind their home. And she came home, and this had happened a few times apparently, with her shoes wet and her clothes wet. And her mum was not that impressed and was fed up, and basically had asked her why she kept going down to the beck. And, you know, why'd you come back with your feet wet like that? And apparently she said that she'd been to see the fairies, and that's why she went down there. Now, Elsie, the youngest one at 9, also said she'd seen the fairies. So she said, oh, yeah, Frances and me, we both see the fairies.
Yeah, of course the 9-year-old or whatever said whatever this teenage cool cousin said, right?
She'd have looked up to her cousin, wouldn't she? She'd have thought, yeah, she knows.
And this girl, the teenager, she's a teenage girl living in a difficult time, having abandonment issues because her dad's at war, like teenage years being super creative times, right? In terms of your imagination, so...
Or perhaps they were doing stuff they shouldn't have been doing, and they just had to come up with a theory or an answer, or maybe they just said it in anger or to be silly. Anyway, the parents were not impressed, obviously, as you can imagine, and they didn't believe them. But the girls said, well, we can prove it to you. I'll take the camera. Give us the camera. We can prove it to you. We'll go and get a picture of the fairies. So apparently they borrowed Elsie's father's box camera. He was an amateur photographer. He had his own darkroom in his house, so photography was clearly not something that was unusual to the family.
No, but also not common in other...
Not common at all, that's what I'm meaning. So not common at all, but Dad was into photography. Mm-hmm. He turned the pantry in the house into a darkroom.
Of course he did. Who needs food when the man has a hobby?
Yeah. Do you know what? I never even thought of that deep.
Sorry. That's me being triggered.
Really? Oh God. Anyway, these girls then they'd said, let me borrow the camera, you know, I'll go get a picture of them. So at the time they had like these plates, so you'd have to put the plate in and then get the picture. And I think it'd have to be still for a while to get these pictures as well. But anyway, Elsie's dad gave them one of the plate, lent them the camera, and they went off apparently down to the beck to get this picture of these fairies. Well, they were gone about half an hour, and when they came back and went in the dark room and processed this picture, there it was. Lovely picture. Frances head and shoulders shot in the foreground, a little bit of foliage and some fairies dancing. Mum and Dad apparently were like, how on earth? I mean, I don't think they still believed them. You'll have to look it up.
I'm bringing up the picture because I've seen it.
It's a beautiful picture. It's really well framed. It's absolutely stunning. We're talking about 2 children having set the picture up because they would have had to, whether there were fairies there or not, they would have had to have set this up to sit still, to put the camera somewhere steady. And Elsie said she took the picture with Francis in the picture, and it would have had to have been still for a little while to get that picture. Now, those fairies are dancing, Dee.
Yeah, and they're the proper winged.
They're winged.
Cutesy fairies, aren't
They're
they?
cute.
They're dancing. They look like they're flying around.
They do. Okay, so we've got this lovely photograph. Dad's got a dark room, hasn't he? I don't know, you're a little bit curious. You think, could a child actually take that picture? Well, possibly if they were skilled and talented and whatever, but whether they could have got the fairies dancing captured is another thing. And it's not blurred either. It's beautiful, isn't it? It's a beautiful picture. So they still didn't believe them, apparently. The mum and dad were like, well, yeah, we don't know how you've done that, but what on earth, But apparently the girls still stuck to their story and said, oh, come on, let's do it again. I'll do it again. We'll take another one. I'll get another one. And so off they went, down with the camera again and another plate, and they got another picture, this time of Francis with what looks like a little hobgoblin. It's not a pretty girl one this time. It's not a pretty girl fairy sort of type one now. This is like looks like a male hobgoblin.
Mm-hmm. Little creepy one with the pointy toes. Yeah.
The creepy one with the pointy toes. And I think the dad and the mum maybe were just like, well, yeah, whatever. You must have done something to get these pictures. And for whatever reason, then nothing happened and life went on and 3 years passed and nothing happened until 3 years later, the mums of these girls went to listen to a lecture that was being given at the Bradford Theosophical Society. And it was a lecture, Fairy Life. It was called Fairy Life. Now, we don't know why they went, but they maybe were interested because of these pictures, or maybe they wanted to talk about the pictures. I don't know. But when they were there, after the lecture, apparently the two women were overheard discussing these fairy photos, these two fairy photos, the one of Francis and the dancing fairies and the one with the hobgoblin. And apparently the people there had said, oh, well, you must show us these. You must let us see copies of these photographs, which they duly did. They showed them, apparently. And then this was fed back to the big cheese, Edward Gardner. He was the General Secretary of the Theosophical Society in England, and he actually lectured on fairies and was considered an expert in the field. So word got back to him that there were these pictures. So can you imagine, he's all this time he's got no evidence of this thing that he's lecturing about, but suddenly there's these two women talking about these fairy pictures that their children had taken.
Yeah, you'd be like super excited, wouldn't you, if you specialized and spent your whole life becoming an expert on something? Yeah.
He was super excited and quite clever too, because he didn't just want to see the pictures, he wanted the negatives.
Okay, clever.
So he wanted the darkroom negatives, which the family did hand over and they did supply. But apparently, Gardner said they were underexposed, so not as clear as he'd like. So apparently he sent them off to a leading photography expert because he wanted to then use them in his lectures. He wanted to have them to, when he talked about fairies, and he wanted to create some lantern slides from them, the ones that with the light behind them. But he didn't just have them made into lantern slides. He had them colorized. He altered the lighting in different places to enhance and also to remove some things from the photographs. And then he did actually use them in his lectures.
So he photoshopped them.
He basically did an old-fashioned Photoshop of them, and he added light and he added colour and he added emphasis and he blurred out the background in places.
Yeah, I can see some of the coloured ones.
Yeah. And then there was something called Light magazine. Now, I think they may have been specialists in photography and lantern slides, etc. And they saw one of Gardner's lectures using these fairy pictures. Now, this is where the connection to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle comes in. He was really interested, Conan Doyle was, in spiritualism, in finding proof of ghosts, mediumship and fairies and sorts of things, and he joined the spiritualist movement in 1917, 3 years earlier. Now, this magazine, Light magazine, had worked with Conan Doyle in the past, and once they saw these pictures they immediately thought of him. Oh, we must tell him, which they did. So they told him about these fairy stories, and actually at the time this must be coincidental. He was in the middle of writing another article for a different magazine called the Strand Magazine, and this article was about fairies. So you can imagine, as soon as Conan Doyle heard about these fairy photos, he thought, gosh, I must have them for my magazine piece.
At the very least, I want to see these.
At the very least, he wanted to see them. So Conan Doyle wrote to Elsie's father, the one who owned the darkroom and the camera and obviously the pictures, asking him if he could use the photograph in his upcoming piece in the Strand magazine. And the dad said, yeah, fair enough. You don't put the girls' names on them.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. That's the Yorkshire saying that. Fair enough. But don't put the girls' names on them. Don't want them to be named, he said. So,
yeah, fair enough. Very young.
Very young. They changed the names of the girls on the photographs when they were published, and it did go ahead. Now, Arthur Conan Doyle was, he loved the pictures, but he had plans for a book. He needed more pictures. He needed more. And so he sent gifts to the girls, and he sent them, he sent brand new, top of the range cameras to both the girls, one each. And he said, he didn't say they had to take fairy photos, but he said, you can if you like, obviously. Use these cameras.
Not saying you have to, but...
Not saying you have to, but if you're down by the beck and you've got your camera with you, take another picture.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Yeah.
But if you can imagine, they were super duper expensive gifts. And I'm guessing the parents thought, well, maybe they felt a bit obliged to, if they accepted them, that they may have come with that weight of thinking, I've got to provide some more pictures, which were duly provided. 3 more fairy photographs were provided now, and they were then used. So Arthur Conan Doyle then did use them in his work and in his book that he wrote about fairies as well. It was called The Coming of the Fairies, and it was published the year after in 1922, and it featured the photographs that the girls had taken. But what we have to remember is that Conan Doyle only saw the Photoshop pictures to begin with. He didn't actually see the original. Right,
okay, gotcha.
He only saw the ones that had been touched up, that had had the light change, that had had colour, added to them and perhaps made a little bit more publishable, should we say. So this is what happened. And he believed them intensely. He wanted proof. For him, they were proof. And although there was sort of a little stink around them, these could be fakes, he stood his ground, he argued, he stood by them, he used them, he believed them, and as did Gardner, and did for the rest of their lives, apparently.
We should do an episode on Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yes.
Because he's fascinating.
He is fascinating.
And I don't know much about his spiritual interests. I just know about a lot of his work, one of the first forensic detectives.
And I think that really helped people to believe him.
Yeah.
Because he'd written about all this forensic, scientific looking into case, like, with Sherlock Holmes. I think people thought, well, that kind of a brain.
He's a science man, a man of reason.
Must have looked in detail at these fairies. Couldn't con Arthur Conan Doyle, could you? I mean, he wrote Sherlock, for goodness sake. So people did believe it, and it was still, like I said, there were always muffles of they were fakes, but they were thought and generally accepted as genuine, or at least not able to be disproved, right up until the 1980s. The 1980s!
That long?
That long.
60 years later?
Yeah.
Are these girls even still alive at this point?
Yes, these 2 girls are now elderly ladies, and these photographs are being looked at again at this time, but they're looking at them through 1980s eyes now with 1980s technology. And it becomes apparent that these photographs are not all that they seem. So the girls, the ladies now, come clean and say, yes, okay, you got us. They were a hoax, but we didn't say anything because they got too deep, and they didn't want to say anything until both Conan Doyle and Gardner were dead. They didn't want to ruin.
I mean, hoax is like a harsh word. They were just kids playing a little game, weren't they?
Yeah.
And they didn't even seem to try to want to make it go far. They just showed it to their parents. They were just playing a little trick on their parents, bless them.
I think they were playing a trick on the parents, and I don't think they expected it to go any further. And it was the mums, to be fair, that had gone to the Theosophical Society and talked about these pictures. So I don't think the girls intended it. And I do think Frances, at least the older one, felt terrible about it for the rest of her life, didn't want to talk about it, and felt awful.
They must have just spent so many sleepless nights in those 60 years, right?
I know, yeah. But there is a couple of points, though, here. Do you want to know how they did it, Dee?
Yes.
Right. So do you remember this book, this charity publication at the beginning? It had a poem in it with the little pictures. Okay. And if you look that up, you'll be able to put this in the show notes as well. The fairies, they traced the fairy figures out of the book. They drew their own wings on them, coloured them in, cut them out, and then stuck them on hat pins, which are very fine, so they wouldn't have been able to be seen that well. And then they just basically placed these pinned fairies in front of the setting to get the pictures.
Oh my God, how clever.
Very, very clever, and amazing that they were able to trick the world.
Cool people, yeah.
But Frances maintained to the very end that the last photograph was genuine. She said the only reason they actually faked them to start with is because the fairies were shy and they didn't want to pose for the pictures. So they made the pictures of the fairies to show the parents, because they did actually see fairies. And she said the final picture, which is slightly different to the others, you can actually see right through the figures on the final picture, were real fairies, she said, translucent, not paper.
I'm trying to work out which one is the final figure. Do you remember which one?
I do, if they were in front of me, but I brought me notes for talking and not the pictures too. But the very last picture that was taken, and what I can do is I can send it to you later for the show notes, is the one that Frances maintained, even as an elderly lady. That was the only one that did actually show genuine fairies. The one that she considers is the real one is that's the one that you're circling. As you can see, those ones are translucent.
Yeah.
The fairies on here.
So they were saying, their logic that they were playing with the fairies, but then the fairies were photo shy, so they faked the photos, but they did manage to get one picture with the fairies.
They managed to get one picture, which actually the thing about that one picture at the end is that it isn't staged. It doesn't have Frances posing, just a capture.
You can barely make out what it is, though.
And you can barely make out what it is. So the girls were saying, yes, they did pose. Yes, they did draw the fairies, but they were only trying to show the parents what they could actually see. And they didn't realise it would go that far. And one last one is a genuine picture of fairies.
Right. So is that something that they've convinced themselves of because of the guilt of 60 years hoodwinking people? Or is that genuinely true? Is that kids' imagination? It's really difficult, isn't it?
It is very difficult. But you know what I found the most compelling was their Antique Roadshow. There is the daughter of Frances, the girl in the picture, brings these photographs to the Antiques Roadshow to talk about. And here in this time, she talks about what her mum had told her through her life, and that Frances was mortified basically to have been involved in the hoaxes, but maintained that last picture was real. So that's another thing to look at if you wanted to find the antique. If you just Google Antiques Roadshow Cottingley Fairies, you will see Frances's daughter talk about it, and they've even got the little box camera that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had gifted to Frances.
Oh, I'm sure we can find that on YouTube.
And the thing that's most disconcerting is the expert's got his fingers all over it, and all the time I'm thinking, don't touch that, or put some gloves on. Oh, precious.
Oh, thank you so much for telling us that story, because I remember I just knew about it in passing and had seen, I think, the first picture that they took. And nowadays you look at that and it seems so obvious that it's like paper cutouts.
It does, but you must look at that book, Dee. If you also Google the book that the girls' fairy pictures were from.
I will do. I'll put up a picture comparing side by side.
Side by side, it's amazing. But then,
But also, can we just say how creative those girls are? Do you know what they went on to do with their lives?
Absolutely, just amazing. Amazing work. And I thought, I'm an illustrator, as you know, but those fairies were very good.
I know, they're super cute. They're really well done.
The girls were only 16 and 9, and apparently Elsie, the 9-year-old, said she was responsible for those pictures.
What a cheeky little monkey. She's the little fae folk.
Yeah, it's just crazy. And while I was doing all this research, Dee, I listened to loads of different things, and apparently fairy sightings are still going on. I mean, and I've listened to loads of them now, and they're all really different. Very, very rarely that they're about these little tiny winged creatures.
Ooh, so what kind of fairy sightings are being reported these days?
I listened to another podcast, if you don't mind me telling you about it.
Oh, yeah, no,
it's just really briefly.
Love a good podcast recommendation.
It's a podcast called the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast, and it's by a lady called Jo Hickey Hall. And she talks to people who are reporting on what they've seen. Now, some of them I thought sounded like alien encounters, characters they'd seen cross the path, bright lights, little sort of gnome-like creatures, or some of them were just terrifying.
I literally, if I saw almost any creature, alien, fae, animal that I didn't recognize, I would do a shit. I would just panic. But yeah.
You just panic, yeah. But, some of these people did, but a lot of them, there's so many stories of modern fairy sightings now, even still now, which I find incredible and fascinating. So I've been listening. I haven't even finished listening to them now. So
I'm going to check that out. What is it? What is it they're seeing? Are they using fairies as an explanation because they don't know the real explanation yet?
Yeah, or are they actually real?
Are they fairies? Yeah.
Or are they real? Like Francis did insist that last picture was real. And they were down at the beck. Remember, we're talking about a really beautiful natural setting, a little tiny stream in the middle of a wood at the back of the house. Again, these natural settings come into it all the time. So yeah, do list it. And
do you think you've ever seen a fairy?
I don't think I've ever seen a fairy, no. I'd be interested to I love hearing about other people's stories, but no, I don't think I have, Dee, unfortunately. That's what I've found out about fairies, Dee. I hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, that was amazing. I loved hearing about all of the different types of fairies, because I definitely got confused by how they all relate to each other, the trolls and the orcs. I don't know if an orc is a fairy, but you know what I mean? Oh, they are? Okay, so basically they all come under the umbrella of fairy, because even the concept was super confusing to me because of now what I understand, all of these different kinds that come under the umbrella of fairy, but also all the different words used to describe fairies, fairy, fae, fae folk, blah, 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 fairy spelt different ways as well. So I get it all more now. And I just love the story of the Cottingley Fairies.
I know. I want to believe that last picture is real.
Yeah, I mean, looking at it, and I will post on our socials, the last picture is totally different.
It is, isn't it? I want to believe, because Frances at the end, she was saying, all the way along, yeah, we did do it, and I'm so embarrassed. Why would she not say all of them were fake then?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know whether, that could be to save face a little bit, or it could be genuinely true. Who knows, right?
I hope it's true.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Glenn, my favorite psychic, Glenn.
Oh, do. And then feedback to me. I want to know.
I will do, because he, for sure, I mentioned this to you just before we started recording, but Glenn, our favorite psychic, I was telling you about him, and you've heard of me talk about him ad nauseum now on our podcast. I mention every episode now.
It does, doesn't it?
He once said that I need to work with the fairy folk, and I was like, I don't know how I feel about the fairy folk, though.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what I believe. I have conflicting thoughts and conflicting knowledge about it. So it definitely helped me clear up a little bit in my head. I need to go and process and decide whether I believe in fairies or not.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. You are one of our regulars on the show, so you will for sure be back in a few weeks with another pair of episodes, and I can't wait to have you back. Thank you so much. And all of your details will be in our show notes as well. If you need an illustrator extraordinaire, Michelle is your girl, especially if you, like me, love things witchy woo-woo and like having that represented in your artwork.
Thank you, Dee.
Yeah. And, I'll post your socials in the show notes so people can see your style of artwork and how cute and amazing. Honestly, I love when you post stuff because it just brings a smile to my face. It's such a nice little cheering moment.
I don't seem to be able to draw anything but cute.
But I like, because you do also love the cute creepy too. And that seeps in sometimes. Yeah.
I do like cute creepy. But it's got to still be cute, though. It's a strange one.
I remember I used to really like a website called Domestic Sluttery, which I don't know if it even exists anymore, but they used to just post cool stuff around the house and whatever. And it was just always awesome, different clothes brands and, but they always had a weekly article called Cute or Creepy. And I always thought, every time I read that, I thought, why does it have to be one or the other? Can't it be both? They're not mutually exclusive. Anyways, so do check out Michelle's artwork. It will just bring a smile to your face. And we will see you, I'm sure, within a few weeks or months.
I will.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Bye.
Bye.
If you want lots more fun, moon info, and all things spiritual, plus our merch shop, please visit our website, weknewthemoon.co.uk. And if you want even more, head over to our Patreon page, patreon.com/weknewthemoon, and check out some of our bonus content. We're also on Facebook and Instagram at we.new.the.moon, and we're also on Twitter at weknewthemoon1. See you next time!